Babylon. For thousands of years, its name had carried the weight of legend. This was the city of Hammurabi's laws, of the hanging gardens, of kings who commanded the fertile heart of Mesopotamia. Once the beating heart of the ancient world, Babylon had been a capital of empires, a cultural beacon, and a city that seemed untouchable. But by the time Rome's legions marched into it, this jewel of antiquity was a faded shadow of its former self. What happened next would make history, not because of how long Rome ruled Babylon, but because of how quickly they lost it. For Rome, the idea of conquering Babylon wasn't just about expanding territory. This was about glory, symbolism, and the intoxicating pull of history. Roman emperors had long measured themselves against the titans of the past, and none loomed larger than Alexander the Great. For centuries earlier, Alexander had stood in Babylon as its master, weaving it into his sprawling empire. To control Babylon was to walk in his footsteps, to claim a kind of immortality. That dream would play a key role in what came next. Centuries before Rome ever dreamed of Mesopotamia, Babylon had already endured rise and fall. After the death of its most famous king, Nebuchadnezzar II, the ruler credited with its great walls and gardens, the Neo-Babylonian Empire began to unravel. In 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus the Great marched in, defeating the last Babylonian king without the city putting up much of a fight. Babylon became a jewel in the Persian crown, but one whose luster would soon dim. Then came Alexander. In 331 BCE, after crushing the Persian army at Gaugamela, he entered Babylon in triumph. He admired its grandeur and even considered making it the capital of his eastern territories. But fate intervened. In 323 BCE, at the height of his power, Alexander died in the city, an event that would haunt Babylon's legacy forever. Without his guiding hand, his empire fractured among rival generals. Control of Mesopotamia passed to the Seleucid Empire under Seleucus I, but Babylon was already slipping into decline as new capitals rose to prominence. By the late 3rd century BCE, the Parthian Empire had risen to dominate the region. Babylon, now just another city on the map, no longer dictated politics or culture. The Parthians favored other centers like Ctesiphon near the Tigris River. Babylon's temples and streets began to crumble. Traders passed it by. Its gardens dried. Yet its name still carried a whisper of glory, a whisper that could tempt a man like Trajan. By the early 2nd century CE, Rome was at its zenith. Emperor Trajan had already expanded the empire's borders further than any of his predecessors, and his ambitions now turned east. Mesopotamia was more than just a far-off land. It was the crossroads of trade between the Mediterranean and Asia, and it was also the front line against Rome's great rival, Parthia. Securing it would mean not only riches but prestige. In 115 CE, Trajan launched his campaign into Mesopotamia. His strategy was meticulous. Instead of rushing in, he fortified his path, leaving permanent garrisons to secure newly taken territory. Meanwhile, another Roman army under Lucius Quietus swept in from the east, creating a pincer movement to catch the Parthians off guard. City after city fell. The key strongholds of Nisibis and Batni were captured, both critical for controlling the trade routes that funneled wealth into the region. By early 116 CE, Trajan had carved out a new Roman province in Mesopotamia, even absorbing Osroene, a Parthian-aligned client kingdom. Coins were minted declaring Armenia and Mesopotamia under Roman rule, a clear signal to the world that Rome had come to stay. Or so it seemed. That same year, Trajan's eyes turned south, toward Babylon. The city no longer held military importance, but for a man obsessed with Alexander, that hardly mattered. Conquering Babylon meant writing his name into the same chapter of history as the Macedonian conqueror. Marching down the Euphrates, he took city after city with little resistance. Babylon itself, crippled by neglect and political irrelevance, offered none. The gates opened and Rome claimed it. In the city, Trajan played the part of conqueror and heir to Alexander's legacy. He visited the place where Alexander had died and planned a symbolic sacrifice there, tying his own reign to that of history's greatest military genius. Roman engineers and administrators began to establish order, fortifications, roads, and the machinery of imperial control. For a brief moment, Babylon was once again part of an empire that spanned from the deserts of the Middle East to the forests of Britain. But beneath the triumph lay cracks. Babylon's population was diminished, its economy stagnant. Maintaining supply lines so far from Rome's heartland was a logistical nightmare. The Parthians, though weakened, were far from defeated, and local resistance began to flare. The more territory Rome seized, the more thinly stretched its legions became, and Trajan's ambitions, vast though they were meeting the harsh limits of distance, resources, and time. By 117 CE, Trajan's health was failing. On his deathbed, he agreed to terms with the Parthians. His successor, Hadrian, had no appetite for holding this far-flung territory. Practical and cautious, Hadrian reversed his predecessor's expansions, pulling Roman forces back to more defensible borders. The grand province of Mesopotamia, including Babylon, was abandoned almost as quickly as it had been created. For Rome, the withdrawal was an embarrassment. It exposed the empire's inability to maintain control in distant lands when faced with determined resistance and logistical strain. For Babylon, it was yet another chapter in a long history of changing masters, a brief flicker of imperial attention before fading back into neglect. Within decades, even the Parthian Empire that reclaimed it would crumble, replaced by the Sassanids, who would wage their own endless wars with Rome. And so, Rome's conquest of Babylon lasted barely long enough to be remembered, yet it remains a striking moment in history. It wasn't the length of their rule that mattered, but the reasons behind its brevity, the allure of ancient glory, the dangers of overextension, and the unforgiving realities of empire. In the end, Rome's shortest empire was less about the city they took, and more about the lesson they learned. Even the mightiest power on earth could not bend history to its will for long. Babylon endured for millennia, outlasting conquerors and empires alike. For Trajan, the city was a prize to be won and a legacy to be claimed. But for history, it was a reminder that the rise and fall of empires is measured not just in the territories they seize, but in how quickly they can lose them. And that's where the irony of Rome's shortest empire cuts deepest. Babylon didn't fall because Rome lacked soldiers or strategy. It fell from their grasp because the weight of history, geography, and ambition proved heavier than even their legions could bear. The Euphrates and Tigris weren't just rivers. They were lines in the sand, boundaries where logistics failed and local resistance thrived. For Trajan, Babylon was never just about the land, it was about immortality. He wanted his name carved alongside Alexander's, not merely in marble back in Rome, but in the living memory of the East. Yet history is a ruthless editor. In the scrolls of time, his conquest of Babylon is a footnote, a brief flash of glory before being washed away by the tides of retreat. Hadrian's withdrawal was pragmatic, even wise, but it sealed Babylon's fate. The city slipped once again into the background, a relic admired from afar but no longer fought over with the same passion. Rome's moment in Babylon was gone, and with it, the illusion that the eternal city could hold every corner of the known world. Still, Babylon's walls, though crumbling, had seen this before. They had watched the banners of Persians, Macedonians, Parthians, and Romans rise and fall. They would see Sassanid standards next, and after them, new empires yet to be imagined. Babylon outlived them all, not by resisting change, but by enduring it. In the end, Rome's conquest of Babylon stands as a reminder. Empires measure themselves by their victories, but history measures them by what they can hold, and for how long. Babylon needed no empire to survive, but every empire that touched it, from Cyrus to Trajan, needed Babylon to prove their greatness. And perhaps that was the city's greatest conquest of all, not being ruled, but being remembered.